My name is Denisha Jones with Defending the Early Years, and I'm here with Jesse Hagopian, and we are promoting his new book, Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. Did I get that right?
Yep.
And so we're here in Boston at the Boston Teachers Union, and we're going live on Facebook for this discussion. So welcome, everyone. Jesse's going to start by sharing an excerpt from the book and like grounding us, and then we're going to have a dialogue about it. So we're really excited for you to join us.
Book sounds right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Over here.
The order just now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I know the last day of spring break and an address snafu makes this a more intimate gathering. But we have a bar here, so we can hang out and have a good time together. I'm just really glad I got to come to Boston and share my book with you all, see my dear friends Ian and Sarah, and get to hang out with you all. This is wonderful. It's been a great book tour in many different cities I've got to go to. People are fired up to talk about this, and I'm glad I could share it with you. And special thanks to Nancy Carlson Page for making this happen and allowing me to come out here and share this and see my friends and everything. So thank you so much.
We have a benefactor.
No doubt. And to the benefactor. You know, Denisha and I have been working together for many years, and it's just one of the great joys of my life to get to work with you and the Black Lives Matter at School movement. And Jessica Tang also helped, and Brent Duncan, so everybody who made it possible for me to come out, thanks so much. I wanted to share a few things about this book before Denisha and I get into a dialogue about it, and I want to hear her questions and reflections the most. But, you know, I started writing this book in 2021, and it was just after a bunch of laws started getting passed around the country to restrict what teachers could teach. First about race, and then about gender and sexuality. And so I knew I had to write something about that. I had no idea, though, what this book would become. And it was only a couple weeks after I started writing and researching for this book that my dad said he had something really important to tell me, and we needed to talk. And he called me up, and I was excited to find out what he was referring to. And he dropped the life-altering news that he had discovered which plantation our family had been enslaved on in Mississippi, in Morgantown, Marion County, Mississippi, and also in Lawrence County, Mississippi. And we knew immediately that we had to get down there, and we had to feel the earth that our ancestors had worked and see what it told us and figure out what it meant for our lives. So we bought plane tickets, and we were getting ready to head down there, and then the Delta variant of COVID surged, and it wasn't safe, especially for my dad, who's older, to fly, so we had to cancel the trip. And then we planned it again. We got tickets, and we're ready to go a few months later, and then my dad had a stroke, and we had to cancel the trip again. Then again, we were planning to go, and I got COVID, which turned into a really challenging form of long COVID, and we had to cancel the trip again. And during this whole time, we're just seeing the proliferation of bills spread across the country that are banning teachers from teaching about what happened to my family down there, right? It felt really personal. And at some point, we just said, we just have to go. We had these health challenges, and we just had kept putting it off, and we just finally had to get down there. And my brother Jamana has a fear of flying that is very debilitating, and he really wanted to go, but didn't think he was going to be able to go. But then, because my dad had had that stroke, he realized he couldn't really travel without helping him get down there. So he decided to get over that fear and accompany my dad Gerald Lenoir down there. And we made it. We got down. My dad had found this town historian who, from a little age, had just asked questions of everyone around him about the history of Morgantown. And he developed into an actual historian in his life and focused on this little teeny unincorporated town, like maybe 100 people or less live there. And this is the one guy that could tell us where the actual plot of land was. And he agreed to drive 4 hours and meet us. And we didn't know what to expect, from this little rural Mississippi town, what perspective on history he was going to bring. But we were so grateful for his incredible, generous spirit and the history he bestowed on us. And he took us right up to the fence and he said, 200 yards over there is where your family worked, on the Lenoir plantation. And we just yearned to get onto the land. Like, we had come all this way, we'd spent all this time waiting to get down there, and like being behind the fence just wasn't doing it. Like, we want to get on the actual plot of land. But he was like, the man who owns this land doesn't live here, and you can't just go on someone's land around here. I mean, 3 black dudes just walking on somebody's land is not safe.
Yeah.
He could like read our mind. Like, me and Jemana were like, we could just hop this fence. But he like read our minds and was like, no.
Yeah.
But then this dude comes rolling up on a tractor, and he sees 3 black guys with a video camera in this little rural Mississippi town where he doesn't get any news or like, what's going on here? He rolls up, he's like, who are you, where are you from? My dad just looked him straight in the eye. I couldn't believe it. He's like, I've come here with my sons to show them where our family was enslaved. And he said, okay, where are you from? And my dad said, California. And he said, I hope you're the good Californians. We were like, oof, okay. Yeah, we're the good Californians. We assured him we were. We didn't define the term. But he disappeared. He's like, wait here. And he rode his tractor off into the woods. And he came back and he handed over the fence. He handed us each a brick. And he said, your ancestors made these. There's a kiln out in the woods where enslaved people made bricks on this property. And it was just incredible to feel something that my enslaved ancestors had created. Like, I took this home. It's on my mantle. It's like the most prized thing I have. So we asked him if we could come on the land, and he agreed. And he took us back to this clearing where my ancestors buried each other. And there was one headstone left. And it was an indescribable experience. It's the most spiritual thing I've ever had. It's we asked for some time so we could do a ceremony to honor our ancestors, and we each brought something we wanted to bury there as an offering to our ancestors, and I wrote a letter on my way there that was what I wanted to say to my enslaved ancestors, and that's the preface to the book. So I thought I'd just read that letter to you all. And actually, I have, this is my great-great-grandma. Let's see if the slide will advance. Okay, first, that's my great-great-grandmother, Laura Lenoir, who was enslaved there. And then this is the Lenoir plantation. My ancestors built that house that the white family is standing on. And
I'll do that if you want to.
yeah, and then just go to the next one.
Okay.
And that's me and my dad and my brother at the Lenoir plantation site where the burial ground was for my ancestors. So standing there in the hot sun, I read this letter to them. I said, "Beloved ancestors, many obstacles have been placed in the way of us returning to the land where you were enslaved, abused, and forced to work to enrich the white Lenoir enslavers. The pandemic, a stroke, a fear of flying, and long COVID delayed our journey here. Before that, the education system withheld any knowledge of where you came from, the cruelty you endured, or the creativity and beautiful resistance you contributed to the world. The system of white supremacy used many tactics to deceive us and prevent our family from making this pilgrimage to where you were held captive and denied manumission. Despite the many obstacles and the plots to hide this place from us and deny us knowledge of this land and your existence here, we have found it. Your family has returned to claim you. We have returned to the forced enslaved labor camp that was politely referred to as the Lenoir plantation. We have returned to the place where you no doubt spent endless hours picking cotton and tobacco with the promise of the lash if you slowed down or refused. We have returned to the site of unspeakable horrors. But we have also returned to the place where you all dared to live. A place where you all had the incredible courage to love, despite knowing that falling in love could inflict a terrible pain to your beloved when they were sold away or worked to death. We are here. We are at the very place where you found ways to guard your humanity from those who thought it was possible to steal. We are here where you sang together, where you granted forgiveness to a friend who hurt your feelings, where you dressed the wounds of those who were injured and held those in need of comfort. We are here to experience a truth deeper than any that can be understood intellectually. We are here to make a promise to you, to this land, and to each other. You will not be forgotten. It doesn't matter if they pass laws that make it illegal to speak of you, to teach about you, or learn about you, because those laws don't govern us. Only the truth and love govern us. And so we will pass on the knowledge of this land and your existence here to our posterity and to all who we encounter. We send to you our deepest gratitude for gifting us the will to survive and the spirit of resistance that you pass to us through your blood and through your stories. With eternal love, Jesse, Jamana, and Gerald. So this book tour, writing this book and speaking to you all and to people around the country is not just a political act or a book tour. It's my promise to my ancestors. It's me fulfilling what I said I would do that day. And it's becoming harder and harder to fulfill that promise in this country today because of the incredible laws that are being passed. And I really want us to think about what these laws mean. In the United States today, do people know that almost half of all kids in the U.S. go to a school where their teacher is mandated to lie to them about U.S. history, where the policy or law states that they have to say that systemic racism was not foundational to the U.S. If the U.S. started with slavery, we're saying that slavery wasn't racist then. That's how extreme a situation we have. And these laws are so over the top. They're so absurd that really only the Onion can properly report on what's happening. Go to the next slide, Denisha. So this is how widespread the attack is. You can go to the next one. Did people see this headline?
Yes. Yes.
of my favorite news stories of the past few years. Right? She reveals to them she's black. Fire her. Right? The Seattle has a version of the Onion. It might even be better. I mean, as good as the Onion is, we have the Needling. And have you checked out the Needling, Ian? You need to read it more. Check it out. Stay up with your Seattle politics. Go to the Needling headline. Florida bans the letters LGBTQ from the alphabet. Right? These are hilarious because they're over the top and absurd. The reality is more over the top and absurd. You can't match the reality with satire anymore. In Florida, the official state curriculum says that slavery was of, quote, personal benefit to black people. Because they got like skills like blacksmithing, as if West Africans hadn't already invented that and been doing that for hundreds of years. In Florida, it's a felony with a 5-year jail sentence if a teacher gets caught in a classroom with a book about race or gender or sexuality that's been banned. One school district even banned the dictionary, right? Because after all, the word sex is in there. The word racism is in there. This is how absurd the reality is. And it's not just the South, right? In most of the mainstream media, you hear about Florida or Texas. But when I say almost half of all kids in the U.S., that's what I mean. So in California, right, solidly blue state, it's not likely to pass one of these laws at a state level. However, 110,000 students in the state of California go to a school district that has passed the same kind of ban that Florida has. Right? In my home state of Washington, we have 3 different school districts that have, and all over the place, book bans. The state with the most book bans was Pennsylvania, more than Florida. Right? It's all over, and in the boundless satire that is the United States of America, we have a situation where Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday. At the same time, it becomes illegal to teach about why we have that holiday. But this is not the first attack on black education. And we hear that everything Trump is doing is unprecedented. We hear that from liberal media all the time. And it's scary, and it's vicious, and it's hateful, and it's awful, and it's not unprecedented, unfortunately. You know, the first anti-literacy law was passed in 1739. Or, excuse me, in 1740 as a reaction to the Stono Rebellion of 1739. The Stono Rebellion was launched by a man named Jemmy, who organized the rebellion by carrying a large sign that said "Liberty!" exclamation point, and he marched from plantation to plantation, collecting enslaved people and fighting back, burning down plantations, fighting back. And when the militia came to put it down, they not only wanted to kill and slaughter all of the rebels, they wanted to kill the very ability of black people to ever write or even think that word again. So the next year they passed the first anti-literacy law that carried with it even the death penalty if you were caught being literate. And that kind of anti-literacy law spread throughout the colonies and then the states, with punishments like losing a finger if you were caught learning to read and write, 39 lashes, and other forms of torture across the country. And what's amazing is that, yes, South Carolina passed that first anti-literacy law in 1740, but they had to pass another one a few years later, and then another one a few years after that. And the reason why they kept passing those laws is because black people kept breaking the law because they didn't respect the law because it was oppressive. And black people snuck off plantations into what were called hush harbors or pit schools, teaching each other how to read and write clandestinely. What Professor Jarvis Givens calls fugitive pedagogy began then and is a thread throughout the history of U.S. education. You know, during Reconstruction, black people built the public school system in this country. Yes, there were, quote, common schools in the North that had formed before that, but how public can we call those schools if many of them did not allow black kids to go to them, right? And in the South, they didn't even have public schools for white kids, right? So there was no truly public education system in this country until formerly enslaved black folks built the public schools because they knew there was no emancipation without education. And it's just the most incredible story of a thirst for literacy. You hear all the time today about the achievement gap and how black kids don't really care about their black families don't value education. That's, you know, no people in the history of the planet have ever fought for education more consistently or harder than black folks in this country, right? During Reconstruction, they not only built the public schools, but sometimes they had to rebuild them. The Klan burnt down over 600 black schools during Reconstruction. And many of those communities had to build and then rebuild again that same school in the quest for literacy. During the Civil Rights Movement, education was central to the black freedom struggle. Whether it was the fight to integrate schools, the Freedom School program that was launched by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1964, Freedom Summer. And again, the Klan bombed the freedom schools. And again, black people rebuilt those schools and kept going. And this goes all the way up into our own time. How did Black Lives Matter at school get started? It started in Seattle when an elementary school teacher designed a shirt at her school that said, "Black Lives Matter, we stand together, John Muir Elementary." She wanted her kids to see that they were loved by their teachers after the summer of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were murdered by police and live streamed all over. And it's so traumatizing, especially for young children. And so they wanted to embrace their black students, not waiting for Black History Month, but right there in September at the start of the school year, hold a festival for their black students where the teachers all wore those shirts. And someone leaked it to the media that teachers were going to wear shirts that said Black Lives Matter. And the school started getting bombarded with hate mail. And then a particularly vicious white supremacist made a bomb threat against an elementary school because they wanted to celebrate their black children's lives. And my friend Wayne Al's son went to that school, and he put me in touch with the educators there, and I said, "What, we want to support you. You know, I'm an organizer with the Social Equity Educators, a union caucus, and what can we do?" And we came up with the idea of having a day that's Black Lives Matter at School Day, where every teacher goes to school wearing those shirts because they can't do a bomb threat against every school. So we passed the resolution in the union, but then our real fear was, well, now that it's been spread throughout the media and everybody knows that this is Black Lives Matter at School Day, what happens if no teachers show up wearing those shirts? That will send a message to kids that their lives don't matter. So we organized this t-shirt distribution operation that was just dizzying. Somehow we got 2,000 t-shirts were ordered, and we to the schools way up north and down south, and it was this massive organizing effort. And then many schools created their own shirts. So by the time of the day, we had over 3,000 educators wear those shirts and teaching lessons about the Black freedom struggle. And people like Denisha heard what we were doing and wanted to spread it around the country. The educators like Tamara Anderson in Philly saw what we did, and they took our 1 day of action, took it to the next level. They expanded it to a week of action, and Denisha helped bring that to a national scale at the Free Minds, Free People conference. And ever since then, the first week of February, we have literally tens of thousands of students across the country learning intersectional Black lessons. And it's just an incredible movement that is a continuation of what our ancestors are doing. I just want to say a word about why this attack is happening now, and then a story of my students' resistance, and then we'll get into a dialogue. Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about why Trump has chosen the schools as one of his main targets and why the right is so focused on our schools. What you heard for so long is that this is about election strategy, right? You convince white families that their children are being shamed by social justice educators, and then you use that to get out the vote for the GOP. And that's true. That is one of the reasons why they are passing these laws. But in the mainstream media, it sort of stops there. That's the motivation. I'll say that it's much deeper than that. It's also about privatization, because if you can get those white families to believe that the public schools are designed to shame white kids, then you can drive them out of the public schools into charter schools, into voucher privatized schemes, and dismantle public schools altogether. And they're explicit about that. If you read the details in Project 2025 or various op-eds in the Heritage Foundation, or you read, God forbid, you read stuff from Christopher Rufo's blog. I had to do that for this book, and hopefully I saved you that experience, the excruciating pseudo-intellectualism. But it's even deeper than that. It is about elections, it is about privatization, but it's about something much more than that. It is about a concept called epistemicide, the destruction of ways of knowing, the murdering of ideas. And the attack on critical race theory is about destroying systems of thought that can help people understand how to fight power, how to understand how white supremacy functions, its intersections with capitalism, and how to dismantle it. And colonizers have always done that, right? The conquistadors gathered every last Mayan book, put them in a giant bonfire, and destroyed one of the greatest accumulations of knowledge that existed in the world. This was the most scientifically advanced society that had the most accurate calendars, astronomy, advanced architecture, works of history, and they all went up in one flame in a giant act of epistemicide, right? When they burnt down those 600 black schools during Reconstruction, that was about eliminating black ways of understanding the world and resisting oppression, right? And we're seeing that again. They want to eliminate black studies, ethnic studies, critical race theory, any kind of oppositional form of knowledge. And they have good reason for wanting to eliminate those forms of knowledge, because they're dangerous, because they actually do teach kids how to understand their world and how to change it. And I'll give you an example to end on. So during the Great Recession, I was teaching middle school, and I got laid off because there was only just enough money to bail out bankers who had sabotaged the global economy, and not quite enough to to keep teachers in the classroom. So hundreds of teachers in Seattle and thousands of teachers across the country were laid off. The silver lining for me was a year later I got hired at my alma mater, Garfield High School, where my man Ian went to. Go Bulldogs. And you know, I got hired like a month and a half into the school year, so that's a difficult position to be in.
Yes.
It was like right before back to school night, which sucks, right? 'Cause I got tasked to teach AP US history. So I come into this class and back to school night, there's all these white parents like, our kid had a sub for a month and a half. They are so far behind. How are you going to get them to pass the AP exam? And as someone who never took AP classes at that school, I was sort of like, that's a good question. Like, I felt like an imposter in that classroom. Like, these classes weren't for me, and I don't know how I'm going to do this. And instead of just succumbing to that pressure and that incredibly violent, like, whiteness that was just coming at me, I was like, you know what, though? Standardized tests are not good learning. And this is not, I'm not going to have my goal be them to pass this test. And instead, I had to create curriculum on the fly, and that was really difficult, right? But I went to the Zen Education Project website that has all this curriculum ready to go. And what I did was, we just did the history of social movements, you know, the women's suffrage movement. We reenacted Seneca Falls and taught about what the best strategies for fighting to win women's rights to vote. We reenacted the abolitionist movement, so all my students became members of different abolitionist organizations. They come together in the classroom and they have to debate what are the best strategies for overthrowing the slave system. And then they compare what they came up with what the actual abolitionists came, and then they learned history that way. We did the same with the Civil Rights Movement. We looked at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and all of my students became members of SNCC. And then they had to debate the real issues that SNCC debate, right? Should we let white college students join SNCC? Because we're going to be going down into these rural Mississippi towns and knocking on doors and asking old black folks to risk their lives to vote. And will these white college students have the sensibilities to be able to make this work? That was a real debate they had, and my students had to think about that. Should we focus on registering to vote? Is the ballot box where we have power? Or should we think about direct action like lunch counter sit-ins and freedom rides? They had to debate that, and then they had to compare it to what SNCC actually decided. We did the same with the Vietnam War movement and the student movement on campus and every social movement I could find. And at the end of the school year, the students ended up doing very well on the AP exam. And it was because they loved history and they decided it was worth cramming some at the end and learning how to eliminate wrong answer choices and distractor questions and all that BS. And they did, and they knew a lot about history, and they did well. But I told them that's not when they passed my test. It was the following year. Because this was the wake of the Great Recession, the state legislature announced they were cutting billions of dollars from the Washington state education budget, and we in the social equity educators said this is not only immoral, this is illegal. Because the state constitution in Washington state says it's the paramount duty of the state to fund education, and it stipulates it has to be over half the budget. And even before these billions in cuts, they were already breaking the law. But these billions of cuts highlighted that the state legislature was breaking the law. So we went down to the Capitol on the day that the House Ways and Means Committee was voting to cut the budget, and a group of us in the social equity educators came into the room before they locked the door and wouldn't allow anybody else in. And we mic checked the room, and I read out the state constitution that was echoed by all my colleagues, and we declared that we were actually at the scene of a crime. And I can't believe I did this. This is my younger days. I pulled out a pair of plastic handcuffs, and I invited them to come into my custody for a citizen's arrest. And you won't believe this, but the police officer in the room had a different interpretation of the law than I did. So he arrested me instead, and I spent the evening in jail. And I came back to Garfield the next day, and one of my students from the year before who had taken that AP US history class, he came running up to me. He said, "Mr. Hagopian, it worked." I said, "What do you mean it worked? What?" And he's like, "Well, I started a Facebook page called Free Mr. Hagopian, and here you are." I love that kid. I said, "Thanks for getting me out, man. I appreciate you." But then the most beautiful thing happened, which was that he changed the Facebook page to walk out against the budget cuts. And in less than 24 hours, the students that I had taught the year before organized a mass walkout at Garfield. They had hundreds of students, over 500 students, and they didn't just walk out and skip school. They created a pamphlet that detailed what the budget cuts at the state level were going to do to their education, including the lack of language classes that would prevent them from getting into colleges without all the foreign language that they would need. All these different details. They marched to City Hall with all these banners and signs they created. They demanded an audience with the mayor, who came out on the balcony and addressed them, said they were right, and they got their picture in the New York Times as part of a growing student movement. It was incredible, and I tell you that story because that is what they really fear. They know that we're not shaming white kids in the classroom. We're teaching white kids to love John Brown, to see Howard Zinn as an example of white people who have linked arms with the black freedom struggle. And that's what they're scared of, that we're giving them examples of white people who have been freedom fighters in the fight against white supremacy. And that's why they're passing these laws. They know that if we teach kids about the history of social movements, that they'll learn that and put it into action with all the inequality that we have today. What an absurdity that we call this the land of the free when we have more people in prison in this country, not just than any other country in the history of the world, not the Roman Empire and ever imprisoned more people. And we're talking about the land of the free. We have imprisoned generations of people's family that have ripped families apart. I taught those kids for years in Washington, D.C., who's everybody's parent. Everybody had a parent locked up, right? And I mean, it's just incredible the staggering levels of inequality and injustice in this country. And when kids learn of the history of how people have fought and won in the past, they're real quick to apply it to today. And that's why they're banning us from doing that. So let me just end with one last thing. Can I read one last passage?
Do you have any more slides?
I'm sorry. No.
No.
Yeah, I probably do. There's the proof.
Oh.
And
Okay.
and there's the Teach Truth
Okay.
Day of Action. Yeah.
Make sure we share those.
I'll just end with what I think where this is going, where we want, what our goal is in this struggle. And I wrote this in the conclusion to the book. There have been many names given to the destination of those seeking relief from racism and oppression. The poet Phyllis Wheatley, who had been enslaved and kidnapped from West Africa before gaining her freedom and becoming the first African-American author to publish a book of poetry, she called the destination deliverance. She wrote, quote, "In every human breast God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression, and it pants for deliverance. The great gospel soul band, the Staple Singers, simply called it a place. In their hit single, I'll Take You There. And they told us that in this place, no one would smile at us while they lied to our face. Martin Luther King called our destination the beloved community. He wrote, quote, "The end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, and the end is the creation of the beloved community." It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. The Black Panther Party called our destination socialism. And as Black Panther Party member Assata Shakur put it, quote, "Capitalism meant that the rich businessman owned the wealth, and socialism meant that the people who made the wealth owned it." Stevie Wonder called our destination higher ground and invited us in his sonically soaring refrain to keep on going until we reach it. This higher ground is not an isthmus with only room for a few. There is room for everybody, and you're all invited to join us there.
Thank you for framing that conversation, getting us started. I think this is a little, all right, so now we're going to have a dialogue. Sorry. Okay, see how that works. There we go. All right, want to make sure you guys watching on live can see it. There we go. All right. So thanks for that, Jesse. That was great. I think you did such a good job sharing parts of the book. But now we want to talk a little bit more. There's so much to talk about, right? We could do this for hours, but we have notes. So you talked about, your impetus for the book, right? Your letter to the ancestors and this history of Attack on Teaching the Truth. And it's so important because we see it in waves, right? Like this happened before.
Yes.
So why don't you talk a little bit about the connections you make in the book to past attacks on teaching truth and what we also see currently happening around Palestine, around other issues as well, and how you see these all connected.
Yeah. I think one of the most important historical periods that we need to study to understand what's going on right now is the era of McCarthyism, right after World War II. We need to understand that during the Red Scare, thousands of teachers were fired across this country. And I actually wrote a chapter that's about half the length of this book on the history of McCarthy's attacks on education that my editor wisely counseled that there wasn't space to include. But it's an incredible history. I mean, in New York City alone, there was over 400 teachers that were fired from teaching. And any teacher that raised issues of inequality was suspected and likely put on my blacklist and fired, right? If you address racism, especially racism, because the Communist Party in this country led the campaign for the Scottsboro Boys, they had all of these anti-racist initiatives. So if you taught anything about race and racism in this country, you were clearly a communist and you were fired, right? And people have some awareness about McCarthyism, generally understand it as an overreach at the time. Some people know that it affected higher education and K-12 schools and fired a lot of teachers. What most people haven't learned is that there wasn't just the Red Scare, there was also a overlapping Lavender Scare. And the Lavender Scare attacked LGBTQ plus folks, and in fact, more people were fired from the federal government having been accused of being homosexual than being accused of being a communist. Hundreds of people. And in Florida, if you can believe it, they set up the Jones Committee, and it was first about rooting out communism, and especially attacking the NAACP, because the attacks on communism weren't really attacks about communism. They weren't worried that the Soviet Union was about to overthrow the United States from within. That wasn't a realistic threat. What they were really worried about is that they called themselves the land of the free, that they needed that image to project globally in order to bring all these countries under the sphere of the United States rather than the Soviet Union. But if you're calling yourself the land of the free and you have apartheid in the country, there's a contradiction that will lead many countries to want to go to the other pole of attraction. And so teachers who are teaching about race are raising this contradiction that is of global interest, right? Global strategic interest to the United States. And so it was, it was viciously attacked. So civil rights activists were a threat to American empire in that way. And so the NAACP was a threat to American empire simply for wanting to fight for equal rights. And so they wanted teachers to abandon the NAACP. And so the Jones Committee first was investigating if you were a member of a civil rights organization, but then it switched very quickly to investigate your sex life. And they called every single woman who was an educator before the Jones Committee and interrogated them about their sex lives with just despicable, intrusive questions. And if you were a single woman, they would assume you were lesbian, and mostly it was those single women who were fired by the hundreds in Florida. But this occurred around the country as well.
Yeah.
So this is the playbook that they're...
It's really like we talked about Florida, right?
Yeah.
Banning, you can't say gay.
Exactly.
Going after teachers, imposing laws, and people say, well, they want to separate the attacks on LGBTQ and on teaching the truth about racism, but they're intertwined, right?
Boom.
They're going after all of these people. Many of the states, North Carolina, Georgia, they're attacking trans folks at the same time. They're saying this is a divisive concept, don't talk about that, and they're kind of linking them because it's always been connected to them.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, it's connect. You heard Ron DeSantis, he banned African American studies from Florida, right? And when he banned it, what he said was, have you seen the curriculum? It's got queer theory in it. This isn't about black people. There are black queer people, fool. James Baldwin.
Right. Bayard
Rustin. I mean, Marsha P. Johnson. Like the largest events of queer identity in this country every year is Pride. Where did Pride come from? It was a riot that was started by black queer people. You cannot talk about LGBTQ culture, tradition, resistance without talking about black resistance. And they don't want to have an intersectional analysis. And we have to learn where their attack came from. They're drawing directly from the Red Scare and Lavender Scare playbook in our era.
And it's happening, we've seen it unfold in the past year with the students on the college campuses, and what's happening in many colleges, and how their higher ed is now becoming under target. If you think about Columbia University, most people know what was happening there. They took a very forceful response to the student protests. Right? They were shutting down. They were working with police. But what did that get them? That got them a federal government that imposed more sanctions on them, right? And so there was no protection, whether you went after the students or not, and whether you capitulated to what the government want, you were still, Columbia is still facing this place where they're still being targeted. And now we see universities kind of coming together. So I think 200 universities or so have signed on to a statement. They're kind of like organizing in response to that. They're trying to. But we've seen law groups and universities who said, okay, fine, we'll do what you want, and they're still being attacked. Right? And so it's another iteration of kind of this the stopping about letting people talk about things that are important that are happening to them.
It's neo-McCarthyism, right? And it's being applied to anybody who raises their voice for human rights in Palestine. And It is sickening. If you cannot see children and schools being bombed and say that is wrong and we should stop funding that, you have a severe moral deficit.
Yeah, and it doesn't protect, right? Jewish children are less safe now because of these attacks on children generally, right? Like, we have to remember that it doesn't make anyone safe to bomb and kill children in school.
And that's why Jewish people are leading the movement to fight for Palestine alongside courageous Palestinians. Especially younger Jewish people are transforming what it means to be Jewish and understanding that Judaism and Zionism are not synonyms. And in fact, there is a courageous tradition of Jewish people who have opposed Zionism from its start, who said, we don't want to separate ourselves off and build an ethno-state with more rights for some. We want to stay and fight for equal rights for everybody. That's an incredible tradition that I take so much inspiration from, not just in the fight around Palestine, but in the fight for a better world and social justice in general.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about this idea of teaching truth, right? You and I were talking about this, but what does it mean to you when we talk about this need to teach truth? Can you share some examples in the book of, like, how do we decide whose truth, right? We can be able to be looking, I love that photo where two people are looking at the number 6 or 9, and from one position it's a 6, and from one position it's a 9, and it's the same thing, right? But it's just about where you're looking from. So how do you decide whose truth are we teaching, or how do we teach truth in a way for young students to understand that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Let's get into it. The first answer I give in the book is the blues is the truth.
He's a blues guy, if you didn't know that.
You know that when you hear John Lee Hooker sing. You know that when you hear Freddie King sing, or so many of my other favorite artists. And when I say that, there is a metaphorical or spiritual aspect to that. But there's something very concrete, actually, about that when I say the blues is the truth. Because the blues was formed by people, a generation out of slavery or formerly enslaved people who had no other avenue to tell their story. And they invented an art form that allowed the truth of their experience to be told when nobody else would tell it, right? And what that reveals is that truth has a relationship to power. And I'll give you an example of how this works. So there is a book that I found. Thankfully, mercifully, it's out of print, but you can get a like Xerox kind of copy of it. And it's a book by the Daughters of the Confederacy called The Truths of History, right? And it is like all these truths about the South that are all about why slavery was good for black people, why they loved it, gave them structure and joy in their life, and all this, right? So you have that truths of history, and then you could compare that to Harriet Tubman, who said slavery was the closest thing to hell. So how do you know which one's the truth? To answer that question, you have to have an analysis of power. You have to have an analysis. I think it's grounded in some of the theories like standpoint theory or strong objectivity, feminist frameworks that were developed to understand your relationship to knowledge. And if your position in society is one where you have to justify inequality, you have to justify the way things currently exist, then what you're talking about is not describing reality. You're not interested in interrogating what exists and then describing it. You're interested in maintaining what exists, right? And if your interests are in maintaining the status quo, then it's very difficult for you to access the truth, because you have to justify what exists rather than interrogate what exists. That's why standpoint theory says it matters what your identity is and what your lived experience is, because if you go to a standpoint of someone in an oppressed situation, they don't have any interest in just justifying what exists. They have to actually interrogate what exists and figure out what it means, right? And that doesn't mean that every black person then has the truth. It doesn't mean that every enslaved person told. In fact, there were enslaved people who wanted to curry favor with their master, right? And then justify what exists so that they could get some scraps. But it does suggest that if your ideology, that it's difficult to get to that position of interrogating reality if you're in a position of justifying it, right? And so oppressed people have an easier time getting to a more honest description of what exists because they don't have to justify it, right? And so I think we have to learn those frameworks of standpoint theory and strong objectivity, right? You know, the way mainstream historians or mainstream journalists talk about objectivity is, I don't have an interest in this, I'm just reporting it as it is. Which misses that everybody has a viewpoint that's informed by the current power relations. So you need to interrogate what is your identity and how is it related to the current power relations. Only then can you begin to access truth, right? Otherwise, you are reproducing narratives that are useful to those in power and not looking at where your standpoint is. And strong objectivity invites us to have a form of objectivity that understands the way power relations are organized.
Yeah, and I think that's so key. It reminded me of, if you read Ibrahim Kennedy's book, Steps from the Beginning. So he has this argument that's brilliant that he sets up where people think that, you know, it was racist ideas that led to the system of enslavement. People had negative views of Africans. And then he said, no. Yep. They wanted to enslave them. Yes. They saw these people as visibly marketable, right? They had been enslaving people forever, right? But you couldn't keep track of them. There was no visible marker, right? And I remember one of the persons like, you can't enslave a whole race of people. And they're like, yes, we can, right? And so that was the thing, but then they needed to justify it. So the racist ideas were used to justify a system of enslavement to people who believed in this religion, right? They needed this justification, right? So you think about how that happened. So then you create all these ideas. You create eugenics. You create all these beliefs that they're inferior, that they're, you come up with all these visions about, well, they're savages, all these things to justify what you were already doing, right? And I think it's that justification that people kind of miss out on.
Yeah.
And that's about the narrative. Then those justifications just pull into the narrative, and you have all of these deficient negative narratives about people, right? And it's part of our education system, right? And so what I love about the book is that you're changing the narrative by introducing us to these amazing new terms, right? We start with uncritical race theory. Yeah. So it's just the opposite, right? So there's uncritical race theory. He calls them truth crimes. These laws are truth crimes, right? You talk about educational closeting, and then this idea of, so the book is divided in two sections, right? Disremembering and remembering. So in the beginning, you really outline how we're being forced to disremember, and then you get into the remembering, and you talk about the healing of organized remembering, which just sounds really powerful. So tell everyone about these terms. I don't want to give too many away. We want you to read the book, but we need to change the narrative. We need to use this language because I think it's super important.
Yeah, I wanted to just clear away some of the euphemistic language that we use and be direct about what we're talking about. The first term, uncritical race theory, I hope that we start to think about the utility of this phrase and think about applying it more regularly. There's a few reasons I think it's really important that we use this term uncritical race theory. The first reason is because they label everything that we do that's anti-racist education, they label critical race theory, right? And they say that what you're doing as a social justice teacher is you're imposing a theory onto kids when what we should be doing is teaching facts. And what that suggests is that they don't have a theory, they're objective and neutral, and what we're doing is imposing theory, right? What we need to do is turn the lens back on them and say, no, you have a theory of race,
Uncritical.
I'm sorry to tell you this. It's a very developed theory of race, but it's an uncritical theory of race that doesn't interrogate where race came from, right? When it occurred in human history, what reason it occurred, how the ramifications of the origins of race relate to what's happening today. At least the old uncritical race theorists in the early days, they had an origin story for race. They said first that God created different races, right? And then they gave white people all the brains and whatever. And then the next form, then the next form of uncritical race theory was a one based in science, that pseudoscience that eugenicists developed. That now we can tell that the races evolved differently and separately, and then the white race is superior. So they had an origin story for race. The current uncritical race theorists, man, they can't even talk about where race came from, because they can't say it was that God made separate races anymore because of the civil rights movement, right? That made those kind of ideas unfashionable. And they can't go back to open eugenics so much anymore. I mean, a few are trying to bring it back now, but it's more unseemly to go back to eugenics. So that's a little bit why they're thrashing around so much right now, and they're so desperate, because the ideological underpinnings of their theory is so weak. They can't explain where race came from. We can say very clearly, right after Bacon's Rebellion in 1679, the first laws were passed in world history that divided black and white people because they had united in a multiracial uprising that overthrew the colony for 8 months. The most profitable colony in the world to the British Empire was run by the enslaved people for their own wealth, and that was a threat to all of empire. They had to not only put that rebellion down, they had to figure out, how do we get these people to hate each other and fight each other from that moment forward. So we know where race came from. Historians have documented this over and over and over again. Right after that, the dictionary starts calling people white and black. It's very clear where race came from. But if they admit that this is the reason race was constructed in the first place, then it shows how they're doing the same thing today with the xenophobia against immigrants, disappearing people off the streets right here in Boston, attacking trans kids,
right?
Everybody, right? They're using the same divide and conquer strategy, so they can't admit how race was invented by wealthy white people to divide and conquer. So uncritical race theory today is any system of thought that denies systemic racism, or claims white people are the main victims of racism, or just tries to individualize it. That racism is about your personal opinion rather than a system built on this. And then I just use the word truth crime because that's what it is. They're criminalizing the truth. Let's not just say that they're restricting teaching, or that there's censorship going on. Those are pretty mild and euphemistic, and they are actually banning the truth when it is a felony to teach the truth. When librarians, even in northern states, have been investigated by police for their collections, we have to call this truth crime. And it makes you understand, when you use that term, that we are entering a world that looks more like 1984. And I hope that helps people understand that. Educational closeting is a term that I developed just to echo back to what happened during the Lavender Scare, and that they are trying to attack trans kids, banning them from being able to play sports, banning them from being able to use a bathroom, and just dehumanizing. And it's horrific. Like, Next Benedict was a two-spirit, non-binary trans student who was beaten up in the bathroom by girls who didn't like their gender identity. And whether it was the injury she sustained from that or from overdosing on pills that the toxicology report showed. Either way, this student died because of their gender identity. And this was a school where Next Benedict had a teacher who was a queer teacher who was pushed out of the school the year before. And it's that sort of undermining of support that is dangerous for our youth. And they want us to think that a teenage queer kid who is struggling with their identity is the problem with our society. That's why you're living in poverty. That's why you can't get health care. This is outrageous. But this is their divide and conquer strategy. Meanwhile, billionaires like Musk laugh all the way to the bank.
Yeah, it's so important to have these terms. Like, we have to change the narrative and pull back the conversation, right? From people who are trying to take it over, right? They're trying to steal it from us, and so I think that's key. So yeah, from here on out, I'll be using uncritical race theory. I was just at the Education Research Conference, ARA, and people were asking, what do you do? I'm not teaching full time, but if I do, I'm seriously going to have my students sign kind of like an agreement. Like, I'm going to teach you something that's probably against the law. And you need to know that, and I don't want to be sued by you after, right? That's it. Like, we're gonna have to start spelling out. This is what we're doing, and please sign. Because you don't know where it's gonna end up. Where someone's saying, "Well, I didn't know I was gonna get this information," and someone is gonna be sued personally over this, right?
They were made uncomfortable.
Yeah, they were made uncomfortable.
As if you can learn without being uncomfortable.
Yeah. I'm just waiting for someone to sue their Algebra 2 teacher because that made me very uncomfortable. Pre-calculus was boring. Like, can I go back and sue pre-calculus books? Because that was the most uncomfortable time of my life. Right? But we have to really think about and be clear to the students, to the parents, to everyone that this is what I'm doing. And you need to know that. And let's just get it out there instead of trying to hide it, right? People are asking me, how do I teach an urban education course and not talk about urban? But that's, they're in Florida. That's their question, right? Is there a book I can use? Probably not. Right? Because they can't say these words, they can't do those things, right? So we have to talk about that. But more than that, we have to talk about resistance. So let's wrap up. You have so many stories of resistance. You follow, I know I told you I've been following, I never met her, but Amy Donofrio, you track her in the book. She was a Florida teacher. Before all this happened, I remember following her post. She took young black high school boys to, where'd they go? To Harvard? I think they went to Harvard and out here. They went met with Obama at the White House. Like, she had these boys on the move. Like, they were doing so much.
Incredible.
And then I think she found out she got fired from Florida Public Schools when the governor said something. Oh yeah, we fired her. She didn't even know. Right? And so she's been, on the news that she had lost her job. So she's one, I'm forgetting his name, but you talk about the principal, the black principal. You start the story off with him, James Whitfield, who during the uprising in 2020, when everybody was saying things like Black Lives Matter, and, he sent a message early in the morning about solidarity around Black lives, and it led, I don't know how many months later, to him before a school board meeting, and someone shouts, "We should fire him." And within a few weeks, he had lost his job, working in the district for over 20 years, right? So you track these stories and others because you are trying to end on this idea of resistance. We're not giving into this. It's happening and it's terrible, but there are ways that people are resisting. So tell us a little bit about the stories of resistance that you were able to capture.
Yeah, that was one of the joys of writing this book, was getting to interview all the people around the country fighting back. If you all had spoken to all the people that I spoke to, you would have a lot more hope right now in this period. You would know that another uprising is coming and it won't be long. I'm not worried at all about a mass fight organizing to challenge all the policies of Trump. It is coming, and it's going to come with a force and an eruption, maybe like we've never seen. What I'm worried about is how far that will go, and if we'll be able to sustain it, and what we can concretely win. But there is a reckoning coming. Like, you can't have the level of contradictions we have in our society, calling ourselves the land of the free, and having the highest incarceration rate, having a law and order president who commits felonies and shreds the Constitution. I mean, the contradictions are just so heightened, and that's always what has led to mass social movements in U.S. history, and so that's coming. And I've spoken to the people who are organizing it right now, and it looks like this incredible teacher in Missouri named Summer Bosimer. Oklahoma. They passed a law in Oklahoma, one of these truth crime laws, that you can't teach the truth, that U.S. was founded on slavery and systemic racism, and also don't say gay laws. So the school district said you have to get rid of all the books in your room until they're vetted, right? Or you have to cover them up. So she got butcher paper and covered up all the books in her classroom. But then on the butcher paper, she wrote, "Books the state doesn't want you to read." And then she added, this is brilliant, she added a QR code to the Brooklyn Public Library that made their collection open to all states, with especially those with banned books, right? And she wrote, "Definitely don't scan this QR code," right? I mean, these are the acts of fugitive pedagogy that are happening every day, where people, my day job is to organize the Teaching for Black Lives study groups across the country. We have over 100 study groups every year, including in Florida and Texas and Tennessee, Iowa, Idaho, Montana. There's a lot of northern states with these same laws. And teachers are breaking the law and teaching the truth about Black history because they're doing it collectively, because they know there's other teachers that have their back and they're not alone. And so I get to zoom into their study group meetings and talk, let them know about the teachers in the other state that are doing it too, and giving them some of the perspective and cheering them on and telling them keep going, and I get to learn from them about how they're resisting, and it's incredible. And you mentioned Amy Donofrio. I'll just maybe end with two last stories. One from her. She was fired for having a Black Lives Matter at School sign in her classroom, but she taught at Robert E. Lee High School. I want you to think about it. Like, what if a Jewish kid went to Adolf Hitler High School? This guy was a genocidal maniac. The Civil War killed more people than all U.S. wars, killed more U.S. citizens than all U.S. wars combined. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed in a war to maintain slavery in this country. Robert E. Lee was the general that led the army, this genocidal attack. And we have a school that's named after him. And why would she want to have a Black Lives Matter sign? Because this school's majority Black, and she wants her kids to know that even in a school named after a genocidal white supremacist, that there's a safe space for them.
And she was doing amazing work with her students before the attack.
She was nationally renowned educator.
That's how I found out about all the amazing things she was doing.
And that's actually who they attacked. In my research, it was the veteran educators. It was the most renowned, respected educators that they actually attacked first. And that's because you only have to pick off a few of them before the rest. Well, I'm not as accomplished as this teacher, and if even they couldn't say it, then who am I? I'm not going to say anything. That's why a new study came out that showed 2/3 of teachers in the U.S. are self-censoring around issues of race and gender, right? And that's what we have to do, is build a movement where more and more people can feel comfortable. But I'm happy to tell you that Amy Donofrio didn't give in. She was fierce in her fight, and movements grew up and different organizations supported her. She got lawyers, she fought back, and recently won her lawsuit, and was a big rebuke of Ron DeSantis. And maybe I'll just just end with a quote from students.
Yeah.
The
While you're
student
looking for that, there's
resistance.
also other people fighting back. A Columbia professor recently was told she couldn't teach her critical race theory class, so she put it online, made it for free. If you are on TikTok and you look up something called Hillman Talk, a bunch of professors started putting classes for free on race and gender on TikTok and creating movements for people to go get this education outside of it. Black Lives Matter School was doing our summer school campaign. The Center for Race and Equity up at University of Buffalo, LeGarrette King, they do summer school programming, right? So there's a lot of people filling in the gaps, putting this knowledge and this information out there as a response. But the movement of faculty doing that has just been amazing. They're like, oh, we can't teach at the university? Fine, we'll make it free. We'll give it to everybody.
I love that.
Yeah.
Check out this student from the Georgia Justice Coalition. I interviewed this student. We were on a panel together actually, and she's Alexis Ames, one of the founding members of the Georgia Justice Coalition. She describes the victories that they had in their Our Freedom to Learn campaign. She said, quote, "It has been an incredible 3 years at the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition since we first started building young people's power towards education justice and towards multiracial democracy. Just this spring, we defeated the largest voucher bill in Georgia's history. We stopped the Don't Say Gay legislation for the second time in 2 years. They keep coming back. We halted policies criminalizing librarians or banning gender-affirming medical care, and we won $25 million for public school counselors that our students need. And last year, we halted every book ban in the state. I should also mention that we just won the largest public school budget in the entire history of the state of Georgia," right? So we're talking about a deep red state where when youth get activated and organized, they have a lot of power, and that is going to multiply across this country in some spectacular ways. And you know, where people are scattered and disorganized right now, as Trump has thrown every single attack he could think of all at once, and it will take a minute for people to regain their balance and to make connections across movements. But those efforts are happening, and I invite everyone to join in the Teach Truth movement, right? On June 7th is our 5th annual National Day of Action, and this has been an incredible movement. Man, people have been so creative with the resistance. The historical walking tours have been my favorite. Instead of just a regular rally, you can do those, but like in Michigan last year, a group of educators, parents, and students organized an event that started at the train tracks where Malcolm X's dad was lynched. And they spoke about that history and how it would be banned if this law passed in their state. And then they marched to the hospital where his dad ended up dying, and they passed out banned books to the kids in the hospital, right? There's just so many creative forms of resistance that are teaching the community about the history we all should have learned, but were never taught, and organizing people against the current truth crime laws. So I really hope that people will think about joining that movement or organizing. We at the Zen Education Project, we have all these resources. So if you want to be part of it, we have a tabling kit that we send to any organizer, and it gives you all these banned books, and then it has a card that describes where the book was banned, who banned it, why they banned it, what kids lose when they don't get to see themselves reflected in these novels and these different stories and these historical texts, and flyers and buttons, and it just makes it really easy for people to participate in the movement. So that's the other thing I'm doing every day.
Yeah, we'll add those resources. We have our banned book club. You featured the book Rosa by Nikki Giovanni, so we'll have to add that too. Yeah, add that
awesome.
Zen resource in there as well too, because we love to promote banned books.
Right on. Right on. Yeah. So I think that, Thank you,
Yeah.
Denisha, for all those questions.
Awesome, and thank you. So I just want to make a plug before we end. June 24th, so it starts June 23rd, is the 7th annual Defending the Earlier Summer Institute. That's day 1, it's a Monday, but day 2 is the 24th, and Jesse kicks us off with a keynote. We are looking at 3 values: equity, truth, and care, and how we use those values in our field to keep pushing forward past this troubled time, right? So we're going to center truth. We have an excellent panel after he talks to have the discussion, so we hope you'll check us out. We'll also be promoting the Teach Truth Day, June 7th, that is right before that Summer Institute. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jesse, for coming and for sharing, and yeah.